Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Our first look today at the Ferrari SF24 and the brand new Red Bull RB20 in a filming day at Silverstone. Multiple leaked images coming out that are definitely worthy of note. Interesting innovations on both cars we're going to discuss today, but especially on the Red Bull, given the major change we can see compared to last year's RB19 is actually inspired by last year's Mercedes. Very much into your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I would greatly appreciate it. This, of course, is the Ferrari SF24. It's red, it's a Ferrari, it looks pretty beautiful compared to many of the liveries that we've had so far. I'm not sure it's quite as beautiful a car as the Ferrari was back in 2022. Couple of things just to note very quickly here, certainly on the front wing, you guys can see this is a consistent trend now. Multiple front wings last year had the nose element going all the way down to the front of the wing. Red Bull kind of changed the game on this and had the lower element of the wing separated from the nose so that air can actually run underneath the car and then very nicely into the floor, the diffuser and beyonds. Aston Martin, when they revealed their car, had done the same thing. Ferrari have now done the same thing as well. So we'll see if Red Bull have any further innovations or whether every team will go down that route. We can also very clearly see as well here on the side pods, this kind of side pod inlet is very much designed in the Red Bull way that they introduced in Hungary last year, with this kind of extended bottom element to help the airflow down into the side pod channel, which is what we see them kind of go for now, right? So look, it's a better livery than many of the other cars. It obviously has this yellow and white inspired situation going on. Okay, people will say it looks like a McDonald's car, but whatever. It's red, it's a Ferrari. This is one of the views from the rear actually, by the way, as well. Notably, there's a duct here, which seems to come in from the front of the halo to the rear of it. I'm not really sure I've seen that elsewhere either. So a couple of new innovations here spotted on the Ferrari going forward. So look, it's not quite as beautiful as the F175 when they had that slightly darker color red. It is a shame to me that the most beautiful solution isn't always the best solution, because these side pods were stunning, and last year they kind of cut them in half. This year, these, beautiful side pod designs that Ferrari came up with a couple of years ago are basically fully gone, unfortunately. They are going with, of course, the standard Red Bull undercut approach. This is the car on track in the hands of Carlos Sainz, but I will say, compared to many of the other cars we have seen so far, certainly the Aston Martin, this Ferrari seems relatively conventional. There's nothing crazy that they've done here, at least on the launch spec. That is one key thing to keep in mind, that these cars we see today and over the next few days are likely to be the launch specs. When the teams turn up to Bahrain for testing in about 8 or so days' time, we will likely see some different changes, and that's been a rumour with Red Bull as well, that the car that they see on track today, and we'll discuss in a second, is not the finished article in terms of what Red Bull have actually been cooking up behind the scenes when we get to Bahrain. The same could potentially apply with Ferrari as well. A couple of notable changes really between last year's SF23, this year's SF24, mainly as F data analysis kind of points out here with regard to the side pod, the undercut. It's not as aggressive as we see on the Racing Bull, on the Aston Martin, or probably on the Red Bull as well, as we'll see going forwards, but it's definitely a step towards that kind of Red Bull concept. One somewhat surprising thing I thought, though, that Craig Scarborough was pointing out was that the suspension design is not the same as last year, but it's the same overall structure. They're still running a pull rod rear suspension and a push rod front suspension. Now, Red Bull do the exact opposite. They have a pull rod front suspension and a push rod rear suspension, and yesterday we saw that the Aston Martin, using what will be the same architecture as Mercedes will do because they buy it from them, they have now switched to a push rod rear suspension as Red Bull have been using. So it seems like most teams will follow the philosophy of Red Bull on their suspension design because they've done it better than anybody else by an absolute landslide. Ferrari, though, are sticking to their guns on this, and despite the fact that they say that 95% of the car is different, their suspension architecture is still fundamentally similar. Now, they are going to bake in more anti-dive, more anti-squat into these suspension designs, such as been the trend of Red Bull, but I must say I'm somewhat surprised because this year's Ferrari, they're not going to change it for next year. Next year is the final year of this set of regulations. There's no way, as far as I can tell, that whatever we see on this car is basically going to be what we see on next year's car. So whatever we see now is going to be baked in more than likely to the car that Lewis Hamilton drives next year at his first year at Ferrari. So we'll see if it's actually good or not when they get to the track. Obviously, there's lots of talk really from Ferrari that, they've made a lot of steps, lots of progress. The simulator data is very positive about this car, but it's definitely not as, this one we see here is not as groundbreaking as maybe I was expecting it to be, given the major innovations that it seems are necessary if anybody actually wants to catch Red Bull. And I expect Mercedes, when they reveal their car tomorrow, will have a bit more to it probably than what we see here on the Ferrari. So they're sticking with that same front suspension and rear suspension, but a completely new platform has been developed. So we'll see if them sticking to their guns actually works out on this. And Charles Leclerc says that the car should be a step forward in several areas. From the impression I have formed in the simulator, I think we are where we want to be. So the belief is the car has had several steps forwards from last year's Las Vegas spec, shall we say, where they did, of course, particularly well in the hands of Charles Leclerc. From last year's car to this year's car is now significantly better than that. Whether it's better enough than that, of course, is another question. And even Leclerc was asked the question during the launch on Hamilton joining Ferrari and says, obviously the contractual discussions are not always done in one night. So yes, I was aware of the possibility, so I knew of that possibility. But actually Carlos Sainz, when asked a similar thing, said, well, it was a bit of a surprise getting dropped for Hamilton, but I'm sure in some respects he can understand why they have come to that decision. So let's get into the Red Bull RB20, right? Firstly, another Christian Horner update, because we can't go a day without one at the moment. Eric Van Haren, pretty much the initial guy to leak this report, says that Horner plans to be at the launch on Thursday and was also at the Silverstone shakedown today that we'll of course discuss right about now. So the belief is the report is going to take weeks to be done. Horner's investigation is nowhere near concluded, but even Bernie Ecclestone, there's been some rumours over the last few days that Bernie, of course former top Formula 1 guy, has been getting involved in this whole discussion, and the report the other day said that Bernie has been advising Horner. A report yesterday said Bernie has advised Horner to resign to avoid further damage to himself and to his family. So we just don't really know what the truth of the matter is, but as I predicted a couple of days ago, it seems to me Horner is going to go down fighting, and I don't know if he's going to turn up to this launch on Thursday as still the team principal, pretending nothing is going on, or whether he's going to, take to the mic and start to expose whatever's going on behind the scenes. That would be world-class entertainment, but, as a professional, it's highly doubtful that he would do anything to quite that effect. We didn't see Horner today at Silverstone, at least in some of the images. We did, however, get pictures such as this. So this seems to happen every single year. Red Bull do their shakedown, their filming day, whatever, slightly before the car actually launches. So we get to see, for some cars at least, some relatively grainy images of the car itself. However, we do have some significantly higher quality versions today than I think we have seen in the past. This, not necessarily one of them, but we can tell that's Max, that's Checo Perez getting in the car ready to go. This, another shot as well of the Red Bull RB20. Now, the first thing you'll notice, of course, is the livery. It's the same. I mean, Max Verstappen said it the other day as well. The car is going to look the same, and the car does look the same. I mean, there really is no surprise about it. To be fair, the livery we see on this is, I would say, identical to last year's RB19 livery, so I wouldn't be massively surprised, because literally even the sponsor placements are basically the same here, as we'll see in a second, than on the RB19 livery. Like, you can actually just compare the side-by-sides here, where Oracle is, and maybe Oracle looks slightly different, actually, the placement of the O, based on the shape of the side pod. We can again see that little indent, it seems, on the side pod here, you can see reflected on the A, and the Bybit one's in the same place. To be fair, actually, it looks like SO's no longer on the rear wing end plate, or the front wing end plate, sorry. So, but basically it's the same car, isn't it? So my theory was maybe it was literally the RB19 livery on the RB20, and then in a couple of days' time they'll reveal the new version, which is going to look the same, let's be honest. But it does seem like there are a couple of changes. But look, it's the same car, nobody is surprised. And to be honest, at first glance, you have to really look closely to figure out whether it literally is the RB19, or whether this actually is the evolution of that car. This is another probably slightly better angle, actually, comparing the two, because the car is slightly tilted up at an angle. There's also some debate. Let's have a look at this front wing real quick, because as I mentioned earlier, Ferrari and Aston Martin and probably Mercedes have gone for this approach now where the front wing, or the nose, shall we say, is connected to the second element rather than the first. Now, we see this on the RB19 on the left-hand side. This year's RB20 looks almost like the nose is connected to the third element and not to the second. I think this is just due to the quality and the lighting, and I think it's due to the paint, because you can see on the RB19 here the way it actually connects to the second. I imagine that's similar, but if Red Bull have gone one step further and somehow connected the nose to the third element to get even more clean airflow under the car, that would be very interesting. But I think if you look closely here, this is the RB19 up top, the RB20 from today in the middle, and then the brand new Aston Martin here, you can see that it definitely feels like the side pod design and architecture is somewhat more compact than it has been previously. It seems to be even more aggressive, possibly, than we have seen from Red Bull even before, and Aston Martin have certainly gone very aggressive in their approach. However, we did finally get a slightly higher quality image. This is the best one we have here from Tora 49 as of today, and it's actually pretty good for one of these leaked images, to be fair. So also it's in the rain, and people always love to look at the spray patterns. You guys can see the, you know, the water coming up here off the side of the floor, which is actually quite fascinating. And whatever we see going on the surface of the car, the major changes that we believe that Newey might have been working on over this winter period were potentially on the floor of the car. So we never really know what that's going to look like until Sergio Perez or Max Verstappen bins it in the wall at one of the first few races. But the key change that people are really diving into here is actually on the rear of the car, on the engine cover, and the structure they've designed towards the rear compared to last year's version, which did not look last year anywhere near as extreme as this. So a couple of people are analysing this, as Pier Giuseppe Donadoni actually says here. Like, you can see how Newey has taken up the upper part of the bonnet, the cannon solution, which is a funny way to describe it, but that is how some people are analysing it. And yeah, so no upheavals, an evolution of the winning concept, very tapered rear ends, areas below the side pods more accentuated. So worth keeping in mind, just as we go through these images, and we'll see them in a second, this is a launch spec Red Bull. We saw Mercedes quite famously, really, back in 2022, they turned up to Barcelona for the first test with a very conventional side pod. When they got to Bahrain, that's when they unveiled the zero pod design. So, you know, still, Newey and Red Bull have the possibility to do the funniest thing ever and put zero pods on the RB20. And of course, Red Bull, knowing that there will be pictures of the cars during the filming day, will probably not want to reveal everything, but it definitely is a different car. I mean, as has been discussed here actually by Craig Scarborough again, on the high inlet, on the deep undercut, that of course they've probably taken a step even further than last year. But this is the point that people are looking at, really. The Mercedes style channel cooling outlets, very similar to this on the Mercedes. So they pioneered this, really, Mercedes last year, the rear of the car having these cooling outlets. You know, people describe them in multiple different ways. The cannons, I guess, as some people seem to like to say. This is from last year's Mercedes launch video at Silverstone. Here we are coming down the old pit straight into Copse Corner, and yeah, you can see very clearly from this angle what was going on at the rear of that car. Massively different, really, to what anybody else had done. We can see the same on the Mercedes here. This, of course, is their side pod, but at the top of the car, above the basically on the engine cover, that's where you'll find these deep channels for the airflow to follow down to the rear, to funnel and control the airflow better going into the downforce generating elements at the rear of the car. So it seems like Mercedes are onto something here, because if we compare the two of them, we can see that this year's RB20, the 2024 Red Bull, and last year's Mercedes seem to have replicated that design, at least to some degree, which is pretty interesting, I've got to say. That, well, we know that Newey, he likes to go up and down the grid, taking note to what every team is doing, and it seems like he's had a look at, or the team has had a look at what Mercedes had done there and said, you know what, that's actually a pretty good idea, let's introduce it to our car as well. So interesting to say that Mercedes might have been onto something with last year's car, but we know that fundamentally the floor, the suspension, the platform control, they were arguably the weaknesses. So it will be interesting to see, I think, if Mercedes turn up this year with a car that looks very much like last year's Red Bull, whereas Red Bull have come along with a car that, okay, is basically last year's Red Bull, but has some elements of the Mercedes and potentially even other cars as well when we see it in its full form, probably in Bahrain. I'm not really expecting them to launch anything spectacular in 2 days when Red Bull reveal this car officially, but when we get to Bahrain, that's when we're going to actually see what Red Bull have really brought to the table here, and whether this launch spec that we see here is actually anything like what Red Bull are actually going to come up with, because I'm expecting them to have made more innovations than we have seen today. today, but it will be interesting if actually Mercedes came up with some pretty good ideas last year the Red Bull are now going to implement, but it's just other elements of their car let them down substantially, and, well, we'll see if Mercedes recognised that this change at the rear was actually good and whether they keep it, because Red Bull seem to have done exactly that and integrated it into their car. But as there has been some rumour on, this RB20 at the shakedown today, just a launch version, and real changes are expected to be shown at Bahrain. So I guess we'll see in a few days whether Red Bull are kind of like sandbagging this launch or whether they have anything particularly spectacular up their sleeves that they are not willing to reveal to the public quite as of yet. And of course, we'll see what Mercedes and McLaren have done tomorrow before the Red Bull launches on the 15th, where we'll obviously see whether Christian Horner turns up there in person or not. Just before we finish out the video, I wanted to mention this because there was a speculation a few days ago that there was a recent Formula 3 test that was done. Now, Kimi Antonelli is being considered the #1 Plan A replacement for Lewis Hamilton at Mercedes, which is quite the thing to say. You know, Fernando Alonso is literally old enough to be his father. We talked about the story between those two yesterday, but he's obviously a talented driver. There's no doubt about it. But there was a recent Formula 3 test where reports were saying that Antonelli was seconds a lap faster than his compatriot in the wet conditions. And people were like, there's no way that's true. Like, you know, let's be real here for a second. But actually, Karun says that from what he's heard about Antonelli, he's pretty special. He spoke with the F3 engineers who ran him recently on a private test day, said he was the best driver in an F3 car since Verstappen, which is quite something given that Antonelli's never driven an F3 car before, I'm pretty sure, and just hopped in it for the first time. This upcoming year, he'll be driving in Formula 2. So, look, I know lots of people are criticising this idea. Lots of people are criticising Antonelli himself, I think, for I don't really know why, and criticising Mercedes' plan to put Antonelli in the car. My feeling is that while, sure, it would be a risk to do so, Verstappen was in Formula 1, you know, before he was even 18, and Antonelli would be 18, 19, theoretically, by the time he was to come in. So I don't think it's a bad idea if Antonelli is as good as they think he is, but Mercedes just don't have that much time to really assess it. They can give him a few races in Formula 2, and then they've got to analyse, does he come straight in to replace Lewis, which is quite the thing to do, or do they send him to Williams for a couple of years, as has been the plan, and might well be the plan for Alonso's point of view as well. Alonso might be thinking, you know what, get me in there for Hamilton, Antonelli can go to Williams for a couple of years, then when Antonelli's ready, he can replace Russell, not me, depending on what Alonso thinks at the time. So lots of pressure raising around this kid already, but, well, if he's as good as Mercedes seem to think that he is, then I imagine he will live up to the hype to some degree. But honestly, the hype around Antonelli is, I wouldn't exactly say more so than Verstappen, but man, it's maybe not too dissimilar. So very much interested in your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.